This video is for Skills for Success. This is Chapter 7, Taking Notes from Reading Material. Here are our chapter goals for Chapter 7. By the end of this chapter, you should be able to discuss the importance of reading actively and using note-taking strategies. You should be able to define highlighting and explain the most effective way to use it. You should be able to distinguish between two types of margin notes and explain how to use them to enhance your reading. You should be able to describe full notes and discuss when to use them. And you should be able to use effective note-taking skills to take notes from fiction material. So if you remember in Chapter 6, we talked about different ways to take notes, and we were specifically talking about taking notes in the classroom. This chapter is talking about taking notes while you are reading from a text or from fiction material. So we're going to start out with a quote. Learning how to take effective notes from reading material is going to increase your concentration while reading. It will save your review time, and it's going to make your learning more active. Our first section is taking notes from reading material. And just like we talked about taking notes in class, the reason that we take notes while we're reading is that it helps with our concentration. Now, the biggest downfall of this is going to require time to take notes. It is a waste of time to take notes on every single school meeting that we have to do. We don't always want to take notes. However, it is going to be a good use of time when the purpose for taking notes is to use them for class discussion or for a test. So this is really where we want to think about before we do our reading, what is our purpose of doing our reading and how are we going to be held responsible for that reading? When we look at our purpose and our responsibility, then that will help us to decide, should we take notes or not? Now, when we're reading new or unfamiliar information, it is going to be a good idea to help us understand that information and learn it, to take the extra time to take notes. Now we're going to talk about the difference between just reading and active reading. So just reading is the most passive learning method. It's where we're going to read the beginning of the material to the end of the material. We're not going to take any notes. We're not going to review before we read. We are literally just going to read. Now, the reason that this is a passive method is because our mind is going to wander frequently. We're going to lose our concentration easily. Now, this is something that I did a lot. I just read. My teachers, my professors would give me assignments to read chapter 1, chapter 6, read chapter 7. I would read those chapters and that's it. I would just read. When I got done with that chapter, I would have no idea what I just read. However, I read it because the teacher told me. This is going to be ineffective because the reader is only going to comprehend and retain 10% over a 3-day period. So what that means is if I read chapter 1, I'm only going to understand and remember 10% of what I read after 3 days. So let's say that my chapter 1 is 10 pages long and I read it, and 3 days later my teacher asks me questions about that. I'm going to remember about 1 page of those 10 pages. That's not good, and really it's a waste of our time since I've only read or I only remember 1 page of it. So reading actively is going to be a lot more than just reading, and it's going to occur when we use one or a mixture of these 5 reading efficiency tools. So our reading efficiency tools are previewing the chapter, reading keywords, reading phrases, reading with a pacer, and adjusting our reading speed. So the difference in those, or the main points of those, is if we preview the chapter, we look at the chapter before we actually read it, it's going to help us gain some background knowledge. We now know some information before we actually get into the chapter. Reading keywords, reading phrases, and reading with a pacer is going to help us read faster. And with that, it's going to help us concentrate more on on what we're actually. And then the last one, adjusting our reading, knowing when to speed up and when to slow down. That's going to help us so that we don't waste our reading. Reading actively is going to help us reduce our mind wandering so that we learn. This is going to result in 50% or more comprehension and retention over that 3-day period. So if I go back to that example, if I read a 10-page chapter, I'm now going to remember 5 pages or more of those 10 pages over 3 days. And when I say that retention over 3 days, that's not with any other studying or reinforcement. That's just from reading. That's a big difference from just reading actively with effective note-taking is going to be a powerful learning combination. Now, this is going to show us our staircase of our kind of learning while we're reading. So reading actively, and then we're going to have effective highlighting, and then margin notes, and then full notes. Reading actively is more than just reading. And the more that we use these other things, we're going to have more comprehension and retention with our reading. So next we're going to talk about effective highlighting. Highlighting means using a colored marker to underline that important information in reading material. It really helps you to become more active in your reading. It helps you focus on what's most important while you're reading. It also then, because you're focused on what to highlight, you are now spending time and energy mind wandering. Now, passive learners, they might say that they highlight, but they're going to do it in a passive way. So what happens is their method is not effective. And usually it's going to be because they highlight too much information or not enough information. The other reason that it might not be effective is that they're going to highlight information without even understanding that information. So these are some rules that we want to remember to effectively highlight. So our first rule is we want to read a complete paragraph or a section before we highlight any. This is really important. And it doesn't really matter how you break it up as long as you are reading before you're highlighting. So like it says, it might just be a paragraph or it might be a whole section of your chapter that you read before you highlight. What this does is it allows you to read it, understand it, and then decide what was really important from that. If we end up highlighting while we read, this is where we tend to highlight too much information. And then when we're done, we might notice that we've highlighted the whole paragraph. We don't want to do that. So read, understand it, and then pick out what was important to highlight. Number 2, you never want to highlight more than a few words or a phrase at a time. Now, this was something that I was not very good at. When I would do highlighting, which I often did in college while I read, I would, first of all, I'd read while I highlighted, and that's a number one bad thing. And then the second bad thing that I did is I would highlight full sentences. And then at the end, I would see that I had almost full paragraphs highlighted at once. That's not going to help me because I'm really highlighting all the information. So now when I go back to read, I almost have to read all the information again. So really when you're highlighting, you only want to pick out a few things to highlight. What was most important? Maybe it's a key term. Maybe it's a quote. Maybe it's just a phrase that you're highlighting. Really try not to highlight in full sentences. And then number 3 is deciding what is most important. It's important to remember that there's no right or wrong information to highlight. However, there's too much and there's too little. So what I did when I was in high school and in college using highlighting is I ended up highlighting too much information. It's not that I had the wrong information highlighted, that I had over highlighted. So watch for that. But you also don't want to be with highlighting, highlighting not enough information. So you've got to. Now, effective highlighting coupled with reading actively is going to result in 50% or more comprehension and retention over a 3-day period. If you notice, that percentage is the same as active reading. Really, what's going to make the difference is, let's say with our active reading, we have 60% comprehension and retention. Well, now when we add in that effective highlighting, that might bring us up to 70% of comprehension. And so it's going to make a difference when we're combining two skills. These are things that you're going to do. You will have directions for those activities on Google Classroom. So creating margin notes. No, margin notes are either statements or questions that you create in the margin of your material. It's used a lot like the recall column in the Cornell method. We talked about the Cornell method in chapter 6 when we talked about taking notes. So it's kind of the same idea. It's a taking because you're forced to locate important information. So what you're going to do is you are going to write that important information in the margin of your book. Now the margin is that place, and it could be on the top, on the bottom, on the left, or on the right of your book. Now I didn't talk about this highlighting, but it's the same thing. You want to make sure that you actually own the book before you highlight it or before you. I would say for any of our school textbooks, you're probably not going to be able to do this. When we're in college, however, we can use our highlighting and our margin notes for those textbooks because we buy those. If we were to have a handout, if your teacher were to print out something else that you have to read, you could definitely highlight or write margin notes on it. Now, when you're studying, you're going to spend less time studying from margin notes because you have less information to read. You're just writing down important information in the margin, and that's what you focus on when you are studying. There are 3 rules that you should follow when you're doing margin notes to make them effective. So just like for highlighting, when you're doing margin notes, you want to make sure that you read a complete paragraph or section before you write anything. And the same idea is that you need to read it and understand it before you can decide what is most important. That goes then into number 2, and really deciding what is most important. Remember, there's no right or wrong information. It's only too much or too little. Margin notes, you don't have a whole lot of room to write. So I would say the biggest issue you might have with margin notes is not writing enough. And then the last thing is using your own words, keywords, abbreviations. Less is more in this part. We want to simplify. So notice down here it says even putting a question mark or an asterisk, showing that that's important information. That's a great way to use margin. Now, margin notes, just like anything else that we talked about with our note highlighting, is going to add some time to our reading. However, again, we're going to have 50% or more comprehension and retention over those 3 days. And so it depends on what we're doing with our active reading as to what percentage we're going to have. Now, there's 2 different ways that we can use summary notes. I'm going to stop my video here though, and that will be in the next part 2